At 11:30 at night on October 24th, 1944, Commander RichardOKane stood in the conning tower of USS Tang, watching through his periscope as his submarine prepared to fire its final torpedo. Tang had been hunting in the Taiwan Strait for 3 days, attacking Japanese convoys with devastating effectiveness. In the past 72 hours, O'Kane and his crew had sunk 7 Japanese ships, totaling over 30,000 tons. They had 1 torpedo left, and O'Kane had spotted 1 more target, a Japanese transport that needed killing. The Tang was the most successful American submarine in the Pacific War. In 5 war patrols, she had sunk more enemy ships than any other submarine in the fleet. Commander O'Kane was the most aggressive and skilled submarine captain in the Navy, a man who took risks that other captains wouldn't consider and got results that other captains couldn't match. His crew trusted him completely, following him into situations that should have got them all killed but somehow never did. Until tonight. O'Kane gave the order to fire the final torpedo. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left the tube, running true on its course toward the Japanese transport. For a few seconds, everything was normal. Then the torpedo started to curve. Instead of running straight toward the target, it began turning in a wide arc. The men in the conning tower watched in horror as they realized what was happening. The torpedo was malfunctioning, running in a circle, and it was coming back toward Tang. O'Kane ordered emergency speed, trying to outrun the torpedo that was now hunting his own submarine. Tang's engines screamed as the boat tried to accelerate, but submarines aren't fast on the surface, and the torpedo was faster. 20 seconds after launch, the torpedo struck Tang's stern with a massive explosion. The blast tore open the aft section of the submarine, flooding compartments instantly and sending Tang to the bottom in less than a minute. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 would survive, spending the rest of the war in brutal Japanese prison camps. This is the story of USS Tang, the submarine that became a legend by sinking more enemy ships than almost any other boat in the fleet, only to be destroyed by her own torpedo in one of the cruelest ironies of World War II. It's the story of RichardOKane, the captain who pushed his luck too far and paid the ultimate price. And it's the story of the 9 survivors who endured torture and captivity after watching their shipmates die in the twisted wreckage of their boat. Submarine duty in World War II was volunteer only, and with good reason. Submariners faced dangers that surface sailors couldn't imagine. You lived in a steel tube under the ocean, breathing recycled air, eating canned food, and knowing that one mistake, one equipment failure, one enemy depth charge in the right place would kill you and everyone aboard. There was no escape from a submarine, at depth. If the boat went down, you went down with it. The death would be quick if the hull imploded from water pressure, slow and agonizing if you were trapped in a flooded compartment waiting for the air to run out. American submarines in the Pacific operated thousands of miles from their bases, hunting Japanese shipping in waters controlled by the enemy. They faced destroyers, patrol craft, aircraft, and increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine tactics. Japanese depth charges could crush a submarine's hull. Japanese aircraft could spot a surfaced submarine and bomb it before the crew could dive. Japanese destroyer captains learned to hunt American submarines with skill and determination. The casualty rate for submarine crews was the highest in the Navy. 1 in 5 American submarines that deployed on war patrol never came home. But submarines were also the most effective anti-shipping weapon the United States had in the early years of the war. American carriers and battleships grabbed headlines, but it was submarines that were strangling Japan's economy and cutting off the flow of oil, food, and raw materials that the Japanese war machine needed. Every Japanese merchant ship sunk was cargo that never reached Japan, soldiers who never got to their destination, oil that never fueled Japanese aircraft. Submarines were winning the war in the Pacific, one torpedo at a time, and the men who volunteered for submarine duty knew they were doing the most important and dangerous job in the Navy. RichardOKane was born on February 2, 1911, in Dover, New Hampshire. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1934 and served on surface ships before volunteering for submarine duty. By 1941, he was serving as executive officer on USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, one of the most aggressive submarine captains in the fleet. O'Kane learned his trade from Morton, watching as his captain took Wahoo deep into Japanese-controlled waters, attacked convoys with reckless courage, and racked up an impressive score of enemy ships sunk. Morton and O'Kane made a perfect team. Morton was the aggressive risk-taker who made the tactical decisions. O'Kane was the precise, calculating officer who executed those decisions with technical excellence. Together, they turned Wahoo into one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific. They developed new tactics, pushed the boundaries of what submarines could do, and proved that aggressive commanders who were willing to take risks could achieve results far beyond what conventional tactics delivered. But Wahoo's success came to an end in October 1943, when the submarine was sunk with all hands during her 7th war patrol. Morton and most of O'Kane's former shipmates died when Wahoo was depth-charged by Japanese escorts in the Sea of Japan. O'Kane, who had left Wahoo earlier to take command of his own boat, lost his mentor and many of his some. At 11:30 at night on October 24, 1944, Commander RichardOKane stood in the conning tower of USS Tang, watching through his periscope as his submarine prepared to fire its final torpedo. Tang had been hunting in the Taiwan Strait for 3 days, attacking Japanese convoys with devastating effectiveness. In the past 72 hours, O'Kane and his crew had sunk 7 Japanese ships, totaling over 30,000 tons. They had 1 torpedo left, and O'Kane had spotted one more target, a Japanese transport that needed killing. The Tang was the most successful American submarine in the Pacific War. In 5 war patrols, she had sunk more enemy ships than any other submarine in the fleet. Commander O'Kane was the most aggressive and skilled submarine captain in the Navy, a man who took risks that other captains wouldn't consider and got results that other captains couldn't match. His crew trusted him completely, following him into situations that should have got them all killed but somehow never did. Until tonight. O'Kane gave the order to fire the final torpedo. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left the tube, running true on its course toward the Japanese transport. For a few seconds, everything was normal. Then the torpedo started to curve. Instead of running straight toward the target, it began turning in a wide arc. The men in the conning tower watched in horror as they realized what was happening. The torpedo was malfunctioning, running in a circle, and it was coming back toward Tang. O'Kane ordered emergency speed, trying to outrun the torpedo that was now hunting his own submarine. Tang's engines screamed as the boat tried to accelerate, but submarines aren't fast on the surface, and the Torpedo was faster. 20 seconds after launch, the Torpedo struck Tang's stern with a massive explosion. The blast tore open the aft section of the submarine, flooding compartments instantly and sending Tang to the bottom in less than a minute. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 would survive, spending the rest of the war in brutal Japanese prison camps. This is the story of USS Tang, the submarine that became a legend by sinking more enemy ships than almost any other boat in the fleet, only to be destroyed by her own torpedo in one of the cruelest ironies of World War II. It's the story of RichardOKane, the captain who pushed his luck too far and paid the ultimate price. And it's the story of the 9 survivors who endured torture and captivity after watching their shipmates die in the twisted wreckage of their boat. Submarine duty in World War II was volunteer only, and with good reason. Submariners faced dangers that surface sailors couldn't imagine. You lived in a steel tube under the ocean, breathing recycled air, eating canned food, and knowing that one mistake, one equipment failure, one enemy depth charge in the right place would kill you and everyone aboard. There was no escape from a submarine. Warfare breeds a dangerous kind of confidence. O'Kane believed that his aggressive tactics and his willingness to take risks were what kept him and his crew alive. He believed that hesitation and caution were more dangerous than bold action. He had survived 3 war patrols by attacking when other captains would have pulled back, by taking his boat into danger when other captains would have stayed safe. This confidence would serve him well on his 4th patrol, but it would destroy him on his 5th. Tang's 4th war patrol in June and July 1944 was nearly perfect. Operating off the coast of Japan itself, in waters heavily patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces, O'Kane and his crew executed a series of attacks that demonstrated everything they had learned. They sank 13 ships totaling over 60,000 tons, bringing Tang's total to 33 ships sunk in just 4 patrols. No other American submarine had come close to that record. The 4th patrol also demonstrated O'Kane's ability to adapt his tactics to different situations. When faced with heavily escorted convoys, he would wait for the escorts to pass and then attack the vulnerable merchant ships. When operating in shallow water, he would use the ocean floor to hide from pursuing destroyers. When attacked by aircraft, he would crash dive Tang faster than the aircraft could react. His crew executed his orders with precision and confidence, trusting that their captain knew what he was doing. But the 4th patrol also showed the growing risks Tang was taking. On one occasion, Tang was trapped between a Japanese convoy and the shore in water so shallow that the submarine couldn't fully submerge. O'Kane had to maneuver Tang on the surface under fire from convoy escorts, dodging shells while getting into position to attack. On another occasion, Tang was depth-charged so severely that light bulbs shattered throughout the boat and equipment was knocked off its mounts. O'Kane's aggressive tactics were delivering results, but they were also putting the boat and crew in increasingly dangerous situations. The submarine force commanders recognized both O'Kane's brilliance and the risks he was taking. They awarded him another Navy Cross for the 4th patrol, bringing his total to 4, an almost unprecedented number. They also suggested that perhaps O'Kane might want to rotate to shore duty to take a break from combat to train new submarine commanders using the tactics he had developed. O'Kane refused. He wanted one more patrol, one more chance to take Tang into combat. He believed he and his crew were at the peak of their skills and effectiveness. One more patrol would cement Tang's place as the greatest submarine in the fleet. The submarine force commanders agreed to one more patrol. Tang would operate in the Taiwan Strait, hunting Japanese convoys, traveling between Japan and the resources of Southeast Asia. It was a target-rich environment with plenty of enemy shipping. It was also heavily patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces who were getting better at hunting American submarines. But O'Kane was confident. He had Tang, he had his crew, and he had the aggressive tactics that had worked on 4 previous patrols. What could go wrong? Tang departed Pearl Harbor on September 24, 1944, for her 5th war patrol. The crew was in high spirits. They were confident in their boat, confident in their captain, and confident that this patrol would add to Tang's already legendary record. They carried 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes, the latest model that left no visible wake and was supposedly more reliable than earlier torpedoes. They had orders to patrol the Taiwan Strait and sink as much Japanese shipping as possible. The transit to the patrol area was uneventful. Tang arrived in the Taiwan Strait in mid-October and began hunting. O'Kane quickly located Japanese convoys and began attacking. On October 10th, Tang sank a cargo ship. On October 11th, she sank a tanker and damaged another ship. On October 23rd, Tang attacked a large convoy, sinking 2 ships and damaging a 3rd. The patrol was going exactly as planned. Tang was racking up tonnage, O'Kane's tactics were working, and the crew was executing perfectly. But O'Kane was pushing harder than ever before. He was taking Tang closer to enemy ships than he had on previous patrols. He was attacking in situations where other captains would have waited for better conditions. He was using every torpedo, not holding any in reserve for emergencies or for the return voyage. Some of the crew were concerned that their captain was taking unnecessary risks, but O'Kane's record spoke for itself. He had never lost a crewman in combat. He had survived 4 war patrols when many submarine captains didn't survive one. His aggressive tactics had kept them alive, and the crew trusted him to keep them alive on this patrol. On October 24th, Tang spotted another convoy, 2 Japanese transports with escorts moving through the strait. O'Kane decided to attack despite the fact that Tang had only 2 torpedoes left. A more cautious captain might have let this convoy pass, might have saved the last 2 torpedoes for more favorable targets or for the journey home. But O'Kane saw 2 more targets, 2 more ships that could be sunk, 2 more victories to add to Tang's record. He positioned Tang for an attack. At 9:30 in the evening on October 24th, O'Kane brought Tang to periscope depth and began stalking the convoy. The 2 Japanese transports were sailing close together with destroyer escorts patrolling nearby. O'Kane maneuvered Tang into position, waiting for the perfect moment to fire. At 10:30, he fired his second-to-last torpedo at the first transport. The torpedo ran true and struck the ship in the engine room. The transport began to sink. O'Kane now had 1 torpedo left and 1 target remaining. The second transport was alerted and beginning evasive maneuvers. The destroyer escorts were searching for the submarine that had just sunk their charge. O'Kane should have broken off the attack, should have taken Tang deep and withdrawn from the area. He had accomplished his mission. He had sunk 7 ships on this patrol, bringing Tang's total to 40 ships sunk over 5 patrols. He had nothing left to prove. But O'Kane saw 1 more target, and he had 1 more torpedo. He maneuvered Tang into position for a surface attack, using the darkness to get close to the transport. At 11:20, he fired Tang's last torpedo. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left the tube with a burst of compressed air and entered the water. For a few seconds, the attack looked successful. The torpedo was running toward the target, the transport was maintaining course, and Tang was preparing to withdraw from the area. Then someone in the conning tower noticed something wrong. The torpedo's phosphorescent wake, which should have been running straight toward the target, was curving. The torpedo was turning to the left, running in a wide circle. O'Kane and his executive officer watched in disbelief as they realized what was happening. The torpedo had malfunctioned, its guidance system had failed, and instead of running straight, it was turning in a circle, and the circle was bringing it back toward Tang. O'Kane immediately ordered emergency speed ahead, trying to outrun the torpedo. Tang's diesels roared to full power, but submarines are not fast on the surface. Top speed was about 20 knots, and the torpedo was making 46 knots. The men in the conning tower could see the torpedo's wake, a line of phosphorescence in the dark water, curving toward them. O'Kane tried to turn the boat to present a smaller target, but there wasn't time. The torpedo track was coming straight at Tang's stern. 20 seconds after being fired, the torpedo struck Tang. The explosion hit the aft torpedo room, exactly where the torpedo had been fired from. The blast tore open the submarine's pressure hull, flooding the aft compartments instantly. The men in the after torpedo room, the maneuvering room, and the after engine room died within seconds, drowned or killed by the blast. The rest of the boat began flooding rapidly. Tang, which had survived depth charges, aircraft attacks, and enemy gunfire, was sinking, killed by her own weapon. The explosion threw men around the submarine like toys. In the forward torpedo room, sailors were slammed into bulkheads and equipment. In the control room, officers struggled to understand what had happened. The boat was flooding from the stern was going down, and nothing they did could stop it. O'Kane, in the conning tower, knew immediately that Tang was lost. The blast had been too severe, the flooding too rapid. The submarine was going to the bottom, and there was nothing anyone could do to save her. O'Kane ordered everyone topside, trying to get as many men out of the sinking submarine as possible. Some men made it to the deck before Tang went under. Others were trapped below when the boat went down. The submarine sank stern first in only 60 seconds, going down to 180 feet of water. Men who had made it to the deck were sucked down by the sinking submarine or were swimming in the darkness trying to get away from the doomed boat. In the forward torpedo room, 13 men were trapped as the compartment flooded. These men still had a chance. The forward torpedo room had an escape trunk, a tube that led to the surface, and the men had been trained in escape procedures. They had Momsen lungs, primitive breathing devices that could provide air during the ascent. At 180 feet depth, escape was possible but extremely dangerous. The pressure at that depth could kill a man if he ascended too quickly. Nitrogen narcosis could impair judgment. The cold water and darkness made everything harder. But staying in the flooded compartment meant certain death. So the 13 men prepared to attempt escape. The escape procedure required flooding the torpedo room completely, equalizing pressure with the sea outside, then opening the escape trunk and swimming to the surface. The men worked in pitch darkness, in water that was near freezing, breathing through their Momsen lungs, trying not to panic as the water level rose around them. One by one they entered the escape trunk, opened the outer hatch, and began the ascent to the surface. Some made it. Others didn't. The pressure differential was too great, or they ascended too quickly and suffered embolism, or they simply ran out of air before reaching the surface. 8 men successfully escaped from the forward torpedo room and reached the surface alive. On the surface, the survivors found themselves in a nightmare situation. They were swimming in the dark waters of the Taiwan Strait, surrounded by the Japanese convoy that Tang had been attacking. Debris from the sinking submarine littered the water. Oil slicks spread across the surface, and Japanese destroyers were hunting for survivors, their searchlights sweeping the water, their crews eager to capture or kill the submarine crew that had just sunk one of their transports. RichardOKane was on the surface, along with 8 other officers and men who had been topside when Tang sank. They tried to swim away from the Japanese ships, but there was nowhere to go. Land was miles away, and they were exhausted, injured from the explosion, and swimming in water that would kill them from hypothermia within hours. Some men tried to stay together. Others swam alone, hoping the darkness would hide them from Japanese searchlights. All of them knew that capture was likely, and that the Japanese did not treat submarine crews kindly. The 8 men who had escaped from the forward torpedo room surfaced near RichardOKane and the others who had been topside. For a brief moment, the survivors tried to organize themselves, to stay together, to figure out some plan for survival. But the Japanese destroyers were closing in. Searchlights found men in the water. Sailors on the Japanese ships threw life rings to some survivors while shooting at others. The situation was chaos, dark water, and bright lights, and men screaming and the sound of gunfire. Over the next hour, the Japanese destroyers picked up 9 survivors from the water. 5 officers, including RichardOKane, and 4 enlisted men. These 9 men were pulled aboard Japanese ships, beaten by angry sailors whose shipmates had just been killed by Tang's torpedoes, and locked in compartments to await questioning. 78 men from Tang's crew of 87 were dead, killed in the explosion, drowned in the sinking, or lost in the dark waters while trying to swim to safety. Tang's 5th war patrol had ended with the submarine sunk, most of the crew dead, and the survivors facing years of captivity in Japanese prison camps. The 9 survivors spent the first few days after capture aboard Japanese warships where they were beaten, interrogated, and abused. The Japanese wanted information about American submarine operations, about where other submarines were operating, about American tactics and technology. The Tang survivors refused to provide any information beyond name, rank, and serial number. This defiance enraged their captors, who responded with beatings and torture. The survivors were transferred to a prison in Formosa, where the interrogation continued. They were kept in small cells, given minimal food and water, and subjected to repeated beatings. Japanese interrogators used torture to try to force information from the prisoners. RichardOKane, as the senior officer, received particular attention. He was beaten repeatedly, had his fingernails torn out, was subjected to water torture, and endured other forms of abuse. But O'Kane refused to break. He provided no information that could help the Japanese, and he encouraged his men to do the same. After several weeks in Formosa, the survivors were transferred to Ofuna, a secret interrogation center near Tokyo. Ofuna was where the Japanese took high-value prisoners they wanted to interrogate without the protection of international law. The camp was not registered with the Red Cross. Prisoners had no rights and no protection. The Japanese could do whatever they wanted to extract information. The conditions at Ofuna were brutal. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, beaten regularly, given starvation rations, and subjected to various forms of psychological and physical torture. The Tang survivors spent months at Ofuna. Some adapted to the conditions better than others. Some men were broken by the torture and provided limited information to their captors. Others, including O'Kane, maintained their resistance despite the abuse. The guards at Ofuna seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting the submarine crew, perhaps because Japanese sailors feared and hated American submarines. The prisoners were reminded constantly that they were war criminals, that submarine warfare was unlawful, that they deserved execution for their crimes. In late 1945, the prisoners were transferred to Omori, a regular prisoner of war camp near Tokyo. Conditions were somewhat better at Omori. The prisoners received slightly more food, were not tortured as systematically, and had contact with other American prisoners. But they were still subjected to beatings, forced labor, and constant humiliation. They witnessed other prisoners being killed or dying from disease and malnutrition. They had no idea when the war would end or whether they would survive to see liberation. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Tang survivors, along with thousands of other Allied prisoners in Japanese camps, suddenly found themselves free. American forces entered the camps, bringing food, medical care, and transport home. The prisoners were emaciated, diseased, and traumatized. Many weighed less than 100 pounds. All bore the physical and psychological scars of captivity. Commander O'Kane and the 8 other Tang survivors were flown back to the United States for medical treatment and debriefing. They learned that they were the only survivors of Tang's crew. 78 of their shipmates were dead, killed in the sinking, or lost in the water afterward. Tang herself was gone, resting on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait where she had sunk after being hit by her own torpedo. The submarine that had been the most successful in the fleet, that had sunk more enemy ships than any other boat, had been destroyed by a weapon malfunction in the cruelest of ironies. The Navy wanted to understand what had happened. Why had the torpedo malfunctioned? Why had it run in a circle? Could this happen again to other submarines? The investigation found that the Mark 18 torpedo had a design flaw in its guidance system. Under certain conditions, if the gyroscope failed or the steering mechanism jammed, the torpedo could run in a circle. This was a known problem that had occurred on other submarines, but it was relatively rare, and the Navy had not issued warnings or changed procedures. O'Kane and the other survivors provided detailed accounts of the sinking. They described how the torpedo had left the tube apparently running correctly, how it had then curved in a wide arc, and how it had struck Tang before anyone could react. The Navy determined that Tang had been the victim of equipment failure, not crew error. O'Kane was cleared of any responsibility for the sinking. In fact, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during Tang's 5 war patrols, becoming one of the few submarine commanders to receive the nation's highest decoration. The survivors of Tang struggled to adjust to life after the war. They had endured the sinking, months of torture and abuse in Japanese prison camps, and the loss of most of their shipmates. They suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the sinking, about their time in the camps, about watching their friends die. Some adapted better than others. Some found ways to move forward with their lives. Others struggled for years or decades with survivors' guilt and psychological trauma. Commander O'Kane retired from the Navy in 1957 with the rank of Rear Admiral. He wrote a book about his experiences, Clear the Bridge, which became one of the most acclaimed submarine memoirs of the war. He spent years speaking about submarine warfare, honoring the memory of the men who had served aboard Tang and advocating for submarine veterans. But he was haunted by the loss of his boat and his crew. He believed that if he had been more cautious, if he had not fired that last torpedo, Tang would have survived and 78 men would still be alive. The knowledge that his aggressive tactics had ultimately destroyed his boat and killed most of his crew tormented him for the rest of his life. O'Kane maintained contact with the other 8 survivors throughout his life. They would meet at reunions, share memories of Tang and their lost shipmates, and support each other through the difficult years after the war. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in combat and strengthened by shared suffering in Japanese prison camps. They were the only ones who truly understood what they had experienced, the only ones who could talk about the sinking without having to explain the details. O'Kane died in 1994 at the age of 83. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His obituary noted his Medal of Honor, his 4 Navy Crosses, and his record as the commander of the most successful submarine in the Pacific War. But it also noted the tragedy of Tang's loss and the fact that O'Kane had carried guilt about that loss for the rest of his life. He was a hero who had saved himself from being eaten alive by survivors' guilt by dedicating his life to remembering and honoring those who died. The Mark 18 torpedo that sank Tang was an electric torpedo that had been rushed into service to replace the problematic Mark 14 steam torpedo. The Mark 14 had suffered from numerous problems early in the war, including faulty depth keeping, defective magnetic exploders, and weak contact exploders. By 1944, most of these problems had been fixed, but the Navy wanted a torpedo that left no wake and was harder for enemy ships to spot. The Mark 18 electric torpedo was the solution. The Mark 18 was powered by electric motors running on batteries rather than steam engines burning fuel. This meant the torpedo left no visible wake, making it much harder for enemy ships to spot and evade. The torpedo had a range of about 4,000 yards at 29 knots, or about 3,000 yards at 46 knots. It carried an 850-pound warhead, slightly smaller than the Mark 14, but still more than enough to sink any merchant ship and damage any warship. But the Mark 18 had problems of its own. The electric propulsion system was complex and prone to failure. The batteries could lose power if stored too long. The guidance system, which relied on a gyroscope to keep the torpedo running straight, could malfunction if the gyroscope failed or if the steering controls jammed. When these failures occurred, the torpedo could run erratically, including running in circles. The Navy knew about these problems but considered them acceptable given the tactical advantages of a wakeless torpedo. Submarine commanders were briefed on the possibility of circular runs and were instructed to fire torpedoes from positions where a circular run would miss the submarine. But in combat, submarines didn't always have the luxury of perfect firing positions. O'Kane had fired his last torpedo from close range, trying to ensure a hit on his final target. The torpedo's circular run brought it back toward Tang before the submarine could get out of the danger zone. After the war, the Navy conducted extensive testing on Mark 18 torpedoes, and found that the circular run problem occurred more frequently than previously believed. The Torpedo was eventually phased out and replaced by improved models. But the lessons came too late for Tang and the 78 men who died when their own weapon destroyed them. Despite the tragic end to her fifth patrol, USS Tang remains one of the most successful submarines in U.S. Navy history. Over 5 war patrols, Tang sank 40 Japanese ships totaling over 100,000 tons. This included cargo ships, tankers, transports, and small warships. Only USS Tautog and USS Flasher sank more ships during the war, and the difference was only a few ships. Tang's record for sinking tonnage on a single patrol, over 31,000 tons on the third patrol, stood for decades. CommanderOKane's record as a submarine captain was equally impressive. His 5 Navy Crosses and Medal of Honor made him one of the most decorated submariners of the war. His aggressive tactics and willingness to take risks influenced a generation of submarine commanders. His book, Clear the Bridge, became required reading for submarine officers. He was remembered as one of the greatest submarine commanders America ever produced, a man whose courage and skill helped win the Pacific War. But Tang's story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing too hard, of taking one too many risks. O'Kane's aggressive tactics worked brilliantly on 4 war patrols. He had sunk dozens of enemy ships, saved downed airmen, and brought his crew home safely every time. But on the 5th patrol, his aggression led him to fire that final torpedo from a position where a malfunction could be fatal. A more cautious captain might have let that last target go, might have saved the torpedo, might have taken Tang home to fight another day. But O'Kane wasn't a cautious captain. He was an aggressive risk-taker who believed in pressing every advantage and taking every shot. That mentality made him successful, but it also destroyed him. The debate about whether O'Kane should have fired that last torpedo has continued for over 80 years. Some historians argue that O'Kane was reckless, that he pushed his luck too far, that he should have been more cautious after 4 successful patrols. Others argue that O'Kane's aggressive tactics were exactly what submarine warfare required, that hesitation and caution killed more submariners than boldness did, and that the torpedo malfunction was bad luck rather than the result of poor judgment. O'Kane himself seemed to believe both things at different times in his life. He defended his decision to fire the torpedo, arguing that every enemy ship sunk shortened the war and saved American lives. But he also accepted responsibility for the loss of Tang and the deaths of his crew, carrying that burden until his death. Today, USS Tang is remembered as one of the legendary submarines of World War II. Her name lives on in a later submarine, USS Tang, SSN 663, a nuclear attack submarine commissioned in 1967. The modern Tang served for over 30 years before being decommissioned in 1998. The name Tang continues to represent excellence and aggressiveness in the submarine force. The original Tang rests on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait in 180 feet of water. The wreck has never been officially located or surveyed, though the approximate location is known from Japanese records. The 78 men who died when Tang sank are listed as killed in action, their remains still aboard the submarine that was their final resting place. They are remembered on memorials at submarine bases and in their hometowns, their names inscribed alongside thousands of other submariners who died in World War II. The 9 survivors have all passed away. CommanderOKane was the last to die, in 1994. Their stories, told in memoirs and interviews over the decades, ensure that Tang's history is preserved. The submarine that sank itself, the ironic tragedy of being destroyed by your own weapon, serves as a reminder of the dangers submariners faced in the thin line between success and disaster in submarine warfare. At 11:30 at night on October the 24th, 1944, Commander RichardOKane fired USS Tang's last torpedo at a Japanese transport. 20 seconds later, that torpedo struck Tang, sinking the submarine and killing 78 of the 87 men aboard. It was the cruelest fate imaginable for the most successful submarine in the Pacific War and one of the greatest submarine commanders America ever produced. Tang had sunk more enemy ships than almost any other submarine. Her crew was among the best trained and most aggressive in the fleet. Her captain was a legendary figure whose tactics were studied and emulated throughout the submarine force. But none of that mattered when their own torpedo malfunctioned and came back to destroy them. In 20 seconds, everything Tang had accomplished, every ship she had sunk, every life her crew had saved, all of it became overshadowed by the tragic irony of her death. The 9 survivors spent the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps, tortured and abused, watching other prisoners die while wondering if they would survive to see liberation. When they finally came home, they carried not just the physical scars of captivity, but the psychological burden of being the only survivors of Tang's crew. They had to live with the knowledge that 78 of their shipmates were dead, that the submarine they had served on with such pride was gone, and that it had all ended in the worst way imaginable. Commander O'Kane received the Medal of Honor, retired as a Rear Admiral, wrote books, and spent decades speaking about submarine warfare. But he never escaped the shadow of Tang's loss. He had been the most successful submarine captain in the Navy, but he would always be remembered as the captain whose submarine was sunk by its own torpedo. That irony, that cruel twist of fate, defined his legacy as much as his victories did. This is the story of USS Tang, the submarine that sank itself. It's a story of courage and skill, of aggression and success, and ultimately of tragedy. It reminds us that in war, fate can be cruel, that bad luck can destroy the best of men, and that sometimes the weapon you trust to keep you alive is the weapon that kills you. Tang and her crew deserved better. They deserved to come home, to celebrate their victories, to live long lives after the war. Instead, they got 20 seconds of horror and a grave at the bottom of the Taiwan Strait. That's war. That's submarine warfare. That's the story of USS Tang.